22 years before Eleanor Hayes stood on a Manhattan sidewalk watching a locksmith change the locks on her own front door. She was 30 years old and holding the best thing she had ever made. It was a Tuesday morning in October of 2001, and she was standing in her small midtown apartment with a rolled set of interior design drawings tucked under her left arm. The ink was still sharp. The measurements were still precise. $8,000, her name on the contract, her vision on paper. A small office renovation on the west side of Midtown. Nothing that would make headlines but hers, entirely hers. Her phone rang. Victor's voice came through warm and unhurried the way it always did when he wanted something, and already knew she would say yes. Elle, I need you today. The Tribeca project, the architect walked off the job this morning. I just need you to come look at the plans for an hour, give me your read on the interior layouts. 1 hour, that's all. 1 hour. She looked at the drawings under her arm. She called her client and apologized and rescheduled for the following week. That was the first time. She told herself it would not become a pattern. It became the only pattern that mattered in her life for the next 2 decades. And the thing about patterns is that you don't recognize them as patterns while you're inside them. You see each instance as an exception, a temporary accommodation, a reasonable adjustment for someone you love. It is only from the outside, only with distance, that you can see what they actually were. A slow and systematic transfer of everything you own, your time, your skills, your professional identity, your future into someone else's name. 23 years later, on a gray November afternoon, Eleanor stood on the sidewalk in front of 114 East 74th Street and watched a locksmith she had never met install deadbolts on a door she had painted 3 times. Bordeaux red the first year because Victor liked it. Matte black the second year because the Hendersons next door complained it clashed with the limestone. Navy blue the third year because she was tired of choosing colors for other people's comfort. She was holding a single suitcase in her left hand and a cat carrier in her right. Inside the carrier, Luna, her black cat, pressed her nose against the mesh and blinked slowly at the street. The divorce had been finalized 3 days ago. Eleanor did not cry. She had already done that alone in the bathroom of a hotel near Grand Central the night after the ruling came down, sitting on the cold tile floor with the water running so no one would hear. She had given herself 40 minutes. Then she washed her face and went to bed. Standing on the sidewalk now, she felt something quieter than grief. It was more like the sensation of setting down a weight you had been carrying for so long that you could no longer remember what your hands felt like, empty. The legal proceedings had lasted 11 months and had been, by any honest measure, a dismantling. 3 weeks before the final ruling, Carolyn Whitfield had called Eleanor's attorney with what she described as a friendly offer, $80,000 in a non-contest agreement. Eleanor had been in her attorney's office when the call came through, and she had listened to her lawyer relay the terms across the conference table with the careful neutrality of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. Eleanor said no. Her attorney looked at her for a long moment. Eleanor, you understand what Carolyn's firm is capable of. I said no. The call ended. Carolyn had not responded. No anger, no counteroffer, no further communication. Just silence. And somehow the silence was more frightening than any threat would have been because it meant Carolyn already knew exactly what was coming and saw no reason to negotiate. Carolyn Whitfield. They had sat 3 seats apart in a contract law lecture at Columbia in the fall of 1994. Carolyn used to borrow Eleanor's notes before exams, filling the margins of her own notebooks with Eleanor's careful summaries. In 1995, when Eleanor's brother lost his job and her own finances tightened to the point of breaking, she had lent Carolyn $400 so she could pay her final semester fees. Carolyn had promised to pay it back when she started working. She never had. In the hallway of the courthouse on the last day of proceedings, Eleanor found herself standing 5 feet from Carolyn for the first time since the case began. Carolyn was speaking quietly to a junior associate, reviewing something on a tablet, composed and unhurried. She wore a charcoal blazer and sensible heels and looked exactly like someone who expected to win. Eleanor stepped into her path, not aggressively, just firmly enough that Carolyn had to stop. Carolyn. Carolyn looked up. Something moved behind her eyes, fast and controlled. Eleanor. The $400, Eleanor said. I never asked you to pay it back. I want you to know that. I'm not bringing it up as a debt. She paused. I'm bringing it up because I think you remember who I was when I lent it to you. And I think you know that what you've built this case around isn't the truth. Carolyn held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, I'm not paid to build things around the truth, Eleanor. I'm paid to win. She stepped around her and kept walking. Eleanor watched her go. She noticed that Carolyn's pace had increased slightly. Not much, but enough. The ruling that followed was efficient and thorough. Carolyn had built the case on 3 pillars, each one carefully constructed over the preceding months. The house at 114 East 74th Street had been purchased in Victor's name alone 4 months before their wedding, and a prenuptial clause buried in the original mortgage documentation established it as separate property. The business assets of Hayes Development Group were held within a trust structure that Victor's attorneys had formalized in 2003, 2 years into the marriage, but drafted in a manner that categorically excluded Eleanor from any ownership claim. And Eleanor had not earned independent income in 12 years. That last point had been delivered in court with the particular cruelty of precision. Carolyn's associate had read Eleanor's employment history from a prepared statement. Her last recorded paycheck from an outside employer dated to 2012. Her professional license in interior design lapsed in 2015. No verifiable client contracts in her own name during the marriage. What the statement did not say, because it was not legally relevant, was that every interior space in Victor's first 4 development projects had been designed by Eleanor, that she had spent 6 months in 2004 living temporarily in their second property while overseeing renovations so the general contractor wouldn't cut corners, that the design aesthetic which had made Hayes Development Group a recognizable name in New York commercial real estate had come initially and substantially from her. None of that was on paper. Victor had seen to that from the beginning, quietly and methodically, in the way that deliberate people see to things. The settlement gave Eleanor $60,000 and 30 days to vacate. Victor received the house, the vacation property in Connecticut, the full investment portfolio in the company. She walked out of the courthouse on a Wednesday morning, carrying only her handbag. On the day the locksmith came, Victor arrived home 20 minutes after Eleanor had taken up her position on the sidewalk. He came from the direction of the parking garage 2 blocks east, and he was not alone. Amber Stokes walked beside him. 29 years old, Victor's executive assistant, and for the past 14 months, the person Victor had been spending his evenings with. Eleanor had known about Amber for 7 months before the divorce proceedings began. She had not raised it in court. It was not relevant to the financial case, her attorney had told her, and raising it would only make her look emotional and distracted. She had accepted this advice. She had buried a great deal during those months. What she had not anticipated was the arrangement of the moment. Victor had called ahead. She could see it in the positioning of the Hendersons, their neighbors of 15 years, standing on the stoop of the house next door, with the careful stillness of people who had been told to be somewhere at a specific time. Frank Henderson had his hands in his coat pockets. Patricia Henderson was watching the sidewalk with an expression of studied concern. Victor had invited them. Eleanor understood this immediately and completely. He had staged it. He wanted witnesses. He knew she trusted people whose presence would maximize the weight of what was about to happen. "Still here," Victor said, coming up the front walk with the easy confidence of a man who had already won every argument he intended to have that day. "I thought you would have found somewhere to be by now." Eleanor said nothing. "No job?" Victor continued, his voice carrying the right distance to reach the Hendersons without appearing to perform for them. "No savings to speak of, no references I haven't already spoken to." He tilted his head slightly. "The settlement money will last you, 18 months if you're careful. Maybe find a studio apartment somewhere in Queens. Learn to live within your means for the first time in your life." Amber was watching the sidewalk. Not Victor, not Eleanor. The sidewalk. Her mouth was a thin line. "Victor," Eleanor said. It was the only word she had spoken since he arrived. He paused, looking at her with the expression of a man who considers interruption a form of bad manners. "This isn't over," she said. His expression did not change. "The papers are signed. The settlement is final. Don't embarrass yourself by trying to fight something that is already finished." He turned toward the front door. "Get off my property before I call someone." Eleanor picked up her suitcase in the cat carrier and walked. She passed the Hendersons without looking at them. She heard Victor say something to the locksmith behind her. Something about keys and schedules, the ordinary business of a man closing up his house for the evening. She was 20 feet down the sidewalk when she heard Amber's voice, very low, not meant for her. "Did you have to do it in front of everyone?" Victor's response came flat and final. "Don't start." Eleanor did not slow her pace. She did not look back. But she noted the question the way you note a detail that doesn't quite fit the picture you've been looking at, and she filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things she was not yet ready to examine. She walked for 4 hours. The math was not complicated, but she did it anyway because doing it gave her mind something to hold on to. $60,000. A studio apartment in a livable neighborhood in New York cost at minimum $2,800 a month. That gave her roughly 21 months before she was completely without resources. She had no recent employment history. She had no professional references that Victor had not already spoken to, a fact he had stated with quiet satisfaction in the courthouse hallway 3 days ago. At 52, after a 12-year gap in her formal employment record, she would be applying for positions in a field that had changed significantly while she was managing a household and raising someone else's ambitions. She called 3 people she considered close friends. The first said she was traveling and very sorry. The second did not answer. The third answered, heard the situation summarized in 2 sentences, and said she didn't have a spare room, but knew of a women's shelter on the Upper West Side. Eleanor thanked her and ended the call. She kept walking. At some point, she stopped at a diner on 7th Avenue and ordered coffee she did not particularly want and sat in a window booth and looked at her phone. There was an email from Victor's attorney sent at 11:47 that morning, 3 hours after the settlement had been signed. It read, "My client wants to remind you that any attempt to reopen these proceedings will result in a motion for attorney's fees. Your $60,000 will not survive a protracted legal fight. He strongly advises you to accept the outcome and move forward." Eleanor read it twice, then she opened the calculator on her phone. $60,000, Tom. A hotel room for the night, even the cheapest she had found online, would cost $89. 30 nights was $2,670. Add food at $20 a day, and she was looking at $3,270 a month before she had paid for a single thing that mattered. At that rate, the settlement was gone in 18 months. 18 months to build a life at 52 with no employer willing to return her calls in a city where the cost of simply existing could consume everything she had before she had done anything useful with it. Her hands were not quite steady on the table. She noticed this the way you notice something happening to someone else with mild clinical interest, as though the trembling belonged to a stranger. Luna made a small sound from inside the carrier on the seat beside her. Eleanor looked at the carrier. She put her hand against the mesh. Luna pressed her nose into Eleanor's palm and held it there. She sat like that for several minutes. Outside the diner window, the city moved through its Tuesday evening with complete indifference to her situation. Taxis turning on 47th Street, a delivery driver threading his bike between parked cars, 2 women walking together under a single umbrella, even though it had stopped raining an hour ago. She thought about the email from Victor's attorney. She thought about what it meant that he had sent it the same morning the settlement was signed, before she had done anything, before she had made any move at all. He had sent it because he was afraid of something. Not of her specifically, not yet, but of the category she represented, a person with nothing to lose and reasons to look. People with resources try to win quickly. People with nothing try to outlast. She finished the coffee. She left $4 on the table. She picked up the carrier and the suitcase and walked back out into the evening. She did not know yet where she was going, but she knew one thing she had not known when she sat down: she was not finished. That was the whole of it. Not a plan, not a strategy, just a single fact she was now certain of. She was not finished. By early evening, she had drifted south and east into the older part of Manhattan, the blocks around the original financial district, where buildings from the 1920s leaned against glass towers, like old men at a bar, slightly out of place and not particularly concerned about it. The streets were mostly empty after business hours. She found a bench near a section of blocks she rarely visited and sat down. She opened Luna's carrier. The cat stepped out, carefully tested the sidewalk with one paw, then pressed her head against Eleanor's knee and began to purr. "We are in trouble," Eleanor said quietly. Luna stepped away from her, knee crossed 3 feet of sidewalk, and sat down directly on top of a metal grate set into the pavement. The grate was maybe 2 feet square, its iron surface dark with decades of rust, the edges colonized by weeds pushing up through the gap between metal and concrete. Luna sat on it with the proprietorial certainty of an animal that has decided something belongs to it. Eleanor looked at the grate. She looked at the faded text on a small plaque bolted to the curb beside it: Metropolitan Transit Authority. Service entrance. Authorized personnel only. 1931. She had read somewhere years ago that New York had dozens of abandoned subway stations sealed off when the transit system was reconfigured in the post-war period. Stations that still existed beneath the streets, intact and forgotten, closed when new routes made them redundant and simply left in place because it cost more to remove them than to seal them. She looked at the padlock securing the grate. It was so thoroughly rusted that the mechanism had fused into a single piece of corroded metal. She reached down and applied pressure. The lock crumbled in her hand like old bread. The street was empty in both directions. The sun was nearly gone. Eleanor reached into her handbag and found the small flashlight she had carried since her days of walking construction sites back when she had a professional reason to walk construction sites. She put Luna back in the carrier. She lifted the grate, which was heavy but manageable, and looked down. Concrete steps descended into darkness. Cool air rose from below, carrying the smell of stone and old metal and something else underneath, something like the inside of a clock that has not been opened in a long time. She counted 32 steps on the way down. At the bottom, the flashlight beam caught white tile, a vaulted ceiling, 8 feet above her, a corridor stretching ahead. The tile was dirty, cracked in places, but attached. The floor was dry concrete, dusty but solid. She moved forward carefully, and when the corridor opened into the larger space beyond, she stopped. 200 feet of platform extended before her, white tile on every surface, walls and ceiling, and the square columns spaced along the length of the space. Brass light fixtures hung from the ceiling in a line, their bulbs long dead, but the fixtures themselves still intact, still elegant. Advertising boards from the 1940s lined the walls in their original frames, selling products that had not existed for decades. At the far end, the dark mouth of the tunnel where trains had once run. To her right, a door marked "Station Manager" in flaking black paint. Eleanor set down her suitcase. She set down the carrier and opened it. Luna walked out onto the platform and began to explore with her nose close to the ground, methodical and unhurried. She walked the length of the platform slowly. At the far end, she found a second door leading to what had been a series of utility rooms. One was full of equipment, rusted and useless. A second was empty, 12 feet by 12 feet, white tile on the walls, a single brass fixture on the ceiling, a door that closed and latched from the inside. She stood in the center of that room and listened. Nothing. No traffic, no voices, no city noise of any kind. Just her own breathing and the faint, distant rumble of a modern subway train running somewhere nearby through a different tunnel, the current system passing close but not connected. For the first time in 11 months, possibly longer, Eleanor felt something she did not immediately have a word for. Not happiness, not relief. It was more like the specific sensation of being in a room where no one is watching you and no one is about to walk in. She went back to the platform and retrieved her suitcase in the carrier. She folded 2 sweaters into a pad on the floor of the small room. She lay down. Luna arranged herself against her side. Eleanor stared at the ceiling in the dark. She had $60,000, a suitcase of clothes, a cat, and a room under the streets of New York that no one knew about. Above ground, she was Eleanor Hayes, the failed wife of a successful man, unemployable at 52, with no references and no recent history. Down here, she was no one in particular. She was not sure yet which of those facts was the advantage. She did not sleep well that first night, but she slept. When she woke, her phone read 6:43 in the morning. She lay still for a moment, assembling where she was and what that meant. The platform outside the small room was perfectly quiet. No traffic noise, no voices, none of the ambient hum that permeates every corner of the city above ground. Just the faint rhythmic vibration of a subway train running somewhere in the connected network, distant enough to feel like something dreamed, rather than something real. She had been underground for 12 hours and had not been discovered. That was the first data point. She checked her phone. 3 missed calls, all from numbers she did not recognize and did not intend to call back. 1 email from her attorney confirming the settlement was processed. 1 email from a former colleague at a design firm she had worked for briefly in 2009, responding to the message Eleanor had sent the previous week, asking if there were any positions available. The email read, "Hi, Eleanor, great to hear from you. Unfortunately, we're not currently hiring, but I'll keep you in mind if anything changes. Best." She had sent that email 6 days ago. In 6 days, in a city of 8 million people, 1 person had responded, and the response was a polite version of no. She put the phone in her pocket and looked at the ceiling of the small room. The tile was cracked in one corner, but otherwise intact, the grout still white beneath the grime. Whoever had built this place had used good materials. Whoever had maintained it had done so carefully for as long as they were able. The abandonment was not a failure of craftsmanship. It was a failure of memory. Someone had simply stopped paying attention, and the station had continued to exist as stations do, patient, instructional, and not particularly interested in whether anyone was using it. By the time she had climbed back to the surface and walked 3 blocks to the diner she had spotted the night before, she had already made the decision. She ordered coffee and used the bathroom and sat in a booth and did the arithmetic a second time more carefully. $60,000 divided by $2,800 a month for even a modest apartment equaled 21 months. 21 months to find employment in a field she had been absent from for over a decade, build enough income to sustain herself, and fight a legal settlement that had been constructed by one of the most capable divorce attorneys in Manhattan. Or stay where she was. Estimate her monthly costs at under $500 all in. The same $60,000 became 10 years of runway if she needed it. Time to think, time to plan, time to be invisible while Victor assumed she was scrambling toward irrelevance. She finished the coffee and left a tip and went to find a hardware store. She bought a flashlight with 4 extra batteries, 2 LED lanterns, a portable water filter designed for camping, a small stove and fuel canisters, non-perishable food, a bag of cat food, and a basic toolkit. She paid cash for all of it. The total came to $187. She stood on the sidewalk outside the hardware store and looked at the bag in her hands and understood something she had not quite articulated before. This was the most deliberate and precisely useful money she had spent in years. Every item had a function. Nothing was chosen because someone else expected it or because it reflected well on her in some social context she no longer inhabited. She had bought exactly what she needed for exactly the situation she was in. 19 hours after descending, for the first time she descended again, this time with supplies and a plan that extended beyond the following morning. That evening she sat on the platform floor with her back against the wall and made a list in her notebook. At the top she wrote what I have. Below that, skills, time, money, a hidden location, and the knowledge that Victor believes he has finished me. At the bottom she wrote what he doesn't know. Below that she wrote a single word: everything. She tore out that page and burned it over the camping stove, which felt dramatic and necessary in equal measure. Then she went to sleep. On her 4th day underground, Eleanor surfaced for supplies and walked into Patricia Henderson on the corner of Lexington and 74th. Patricia saw her from half a block away and crossed the street with the purposeful speed of someone who had been rehearsing a conversation. She was wearing the expression Eleanor recognized from charity events, the one that meant someone was about to be kind, in a way that was mostly about the person being kind. Eleanor, I've been thinking about you constantly. Frank and I have the guest room, you know we do, and we absolutely want you to. I have a place, Patricia. Patricia blinked. Where I mean, if you need time to find something permanent, we could. I appreciate it. Eleanor kept her voice even. But I need to ask you something. When Victor said what he said on Monday in front of you and Frank, did either of you say anything to him? Patricia looked at the sidewalk. Frank went inside, Eleanor said. You looked at your shoes. I saw that. Eleanor, we didn't want to get in the middle of... I'm not angry with you, Eleanor said. I want you to understand that. But I also want you to understand that what I need right now is not a guest room. What I need is time to do something. And I'm going to do it whether or not anyone I've known for 15 years believes I can. She adjusted her grip on the shopping bag. Tell Frank I said hello. She walked away without waiting for a response. She was 2 blocks away when she noticed she was walking faster than usual and that the tightness she had been carrying in her chest since the courthouse had loosened slightly, but perceptibly like a knot that has been worked at long enough to give. She had not asked for sympathy. She had not needed to explain herself. She had simply said what was true. It was a small thing, but it was the first time in months she had said exactly what she meant to exactly the person she meant it for, and the feeling it produced was so unfamiliar that she stopped at the corner and stood there for a moment just to recognize it. That evening, returning to the station through the grate on the now familiar route, Eleanor descended with a bag of supplies in one hand and the carrier in the other, and at the bottom she set everything down and took out the small flashlight and walked to the end of the platform where the utility rooms were. She had noticed something the night before without quite registering it. A section of the far wall in the second utility room where the tile gave way to bare concrete had a metal panel about 2 feet across set flush with the wall and secured with heavy screws. It did not match the rest of the station's construction. The rest of the station was all 1931 all Art Deco tile and cast iron and brass. This panel was different. The screws were a different gauge, the metal a different grade. Someone had installed it after the station closed. She knocked on it with her knuckles. The sound that came back was not the flat thud of solid concrete. It was hollow. She did not have the tools to open it tonight. She went back to the main room and took out a marker from her bag and put a small X on the wall beside the panel at eye level where she would see it every time she walked past. Then she went about the business of setting up camp. The platform stretched away in both directions, 200 feet of vaulted ceiling and brass fixtures and vintage advertising that had not been seen by anyone in 70 years. She was sitting in a room that the city had sealed off and forgotten, in a space that no one alive had any particular reason to care about. She thought about the panel on the wall, the hollow sound. Someone had put something there, and then the station had closed, and then the bank above had closed, and then 20 years had passed, and then 40, and then 70. Some things get buried because they are worthless, she thought, and some things get buried because they are the opposite. She turned off the lantern and lay down in the dark and listened to Luna purr beside her. Tomorrow, she would go to the library. She would start with the history of the station and the bank above it and the people who had used this space in the years before it was sealed. She would start with what she could find, and she would find what she could, and she would keep finding until she understood what was behind that panel. She was not in a hurry. Victor believed she had nowhere to go and nothing to work with, and no capacity to threaten anything he had built. Every advantage he had ever used against her had come from knowing exactly where she was and what she was doing. He did not know where she was, he did not know what she was doing. And in the dark 32 steps below the streets of New York, Eleanor Hayes closed her eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, she felt something that was almost like the beginning of a plan. The library opened at 9. Eleanor was there at 8:53, standing on the sidewalk outside the 42nd Street branch, with a cup of coffee from the diner and 6 power banks in a canvas tote bag. She had been awake since 5. She had not wasted the extra hours. By the time the doors opened, she already knew what she was looking for. The name on the curb plaque had stayed with her through the night the way certain words do when your mind decides they matter before you consciously agree. Hartwell and Crane. It had the sound of money, the particular cadence of old New York banking, 2 surnames joined by a conjunction that implied permanence and partnership. She wanted to know what had happened to both. She found a seat at a terminal near the window where the morning light came in flat and gray, plugged 2 power banks into the outlet below the desk without drawing attention to herself, and began. Hartwell and Crane Bank had been incorporated in 1927, one of dozens of private financial institutions that opened in the years before the crash, serving the merchants and brokers of the lower Manhattan financial district. It had survived 1929, which spoke to either conservative management or good fortune or both. Through the 30s and 40s, it had operated steadily, never large enough to attract significant regulatory attention, never small enough to be absorbed by its bigger neighbors. The station below had been part of its identity, a private transit access point for the bank's staff, and preferred clients sealed off when the city reconfigured the subway lines in 1952 and simply left in place when the building changed hands over the following decades. The bank itself had lasted until 1974. The oil crisis, a series of bad commercial loans, and a run on deposits in the late summer of that year had finished it. Its assets and liabilities had been acquired by First National Group in November 1974. The transition had been documented in the financial press as orderly and complete. Eleanor searched for records of the property transfer, specifically any inventory of physical assets at the 94 Broadway address. She found the acquisition agreement in a digitized archive of financial regulatory documents. She read it twice. There was no mention of a vault at the subterranean level, no mention of a secondary storage facility, no mention of anything below the ground floor. She sat back in her chair. In 1974, when First National Group had taken over Hartwell and Crane, they had cataloged everything they could see, everything above ground, everything on the official floor plans, everything that appeared in the building's documented history. What was in the sealed station below had not appeared in any of those documents because no one in 1974 had known it was there, and the people who had known before 1974 were either gone or had chosen not to mention it. 50 years of institutional forgetting. She plugged in a third power bank and kept reading. The routine she built over the following weeks was not glamorous, but it was hers, and it worked with a precision that surprised her. She rose at 5, reached the diner by 5:30, used the facilities, drank one coffee at the counter, and was walking toward the library by 6:15 with her bag of power banks and her notebook. The library staff changed shifts at 9, and the morning crew had learned to recognize her the way people learn to recognize anyone who shows up every day at the same time without interest, without suspicion, simply as part of the expected furniture of the morning. It was on the 11th day that Roy noticed. He was the head reference librarian, 55 or so thick through the shoulders in the way of a man who had been athletic decades ago and still carried the frame of it. He had watched Eleanor for a week and a half without saying anything, and then on a Tuesday morning, he stopped beside her table and looked at the canvas tote and the 6 power banks lined up in a row beside her laptop. "I need to ask you directly," he said. "What are you charging and how much of it?" Eleanor looked up. She considered several possible answers and chose the true one. "I don't have a permanent address right now. I need light to read in the evenings. These are what provided." Roy looked at her for a moment. Not with pity, she noted, with the specific quality of attention that belongs to someone who is taking a situation seriously. "There's an outlet bank on the east wall behind the periodical shelf," he said. 6 sockets. Nobody uses them because the lighting in that section is poor, and most people prefer to sit near the windows. He picked up a folder from the adjacent cart and opened it. "I can't recall ever seeing a policy that restricts the number of devices a patron may charge at one time." He walked away without looking back. Eleanor watched him go. She thought about what it meant to be helped by someone who asked nothing from you in return, who simply identified a problem and resolved it without requiring you to be grateful out loud. It was a particular kind of dignity, the dignity of a transaction that costs the giver something and asks the receiver for nothing except to accept it quietly. She moved her setup to the east wall. The tile work took 3 weeks. She worked in sections, 2 hours each evening, starting from the entrance corridor and moving toward the platform. The grime came up in layers. First dust, which lifted easily. Then a darker residue that required the cleaning solution she had found at the hardware store applied with a brush and left to sit before being scrubbed. Then underneath that, the original surface. It was on the 9th evening, working on a section of the south wall midway down the platform, that the tile revealed itself completely for the first time. Eleanor sat back on her heels and held the lantern up. Emerald green and gold. An Art Deco geometric pattern that repeated across every surface of the station, a design that would have been new and striking when the station opened in 1931, sophisticated enough to signal that this was not an ordinary transit stop, but a place built for people who expected their surroundings to reflect a certain standard. Someone had put real thought into this. Someone had cared what it looked like. She found the signature 3 evenings later, working on the brass trim above the tunnel entrance at the far end of the platform, stamped into the metal in letters small enough that you would only see them if you were close and looking A.F. Crane. 1931. The architect had been the founder's son. He had signed his own station in a place where no one would see it unless they were paying the specific kind of attention that comes from working with your hands close to the surface. Eleanor pressed her thumb against the letters and felt the indentations sharp still after 90 years. She understood the impulse. You make something and you want there to be a record that you made it, even if only for whoever comes next, even if that is no one for a very long time. She went back to scrubbing. Moving the sofa took 3 hours and a piece of plywood. She had found it on a Tuesday morning on West 84th, set out on the curb with a tag that said, "Free leather worn soft at the armrest, mid-century in style, and still solid in the frame." The problem was the stairs. 32 steps down at a steep angle with a 90-degree turn at the bottom, and no one to help her manage the weight. She went to the hardware store and bought a sheet of 1/4-inch plywood. She laid it over the stairs to create a ramp, secured it at the top with a section of rope looped around the grate frame, and spent 40 minutes engineering a system of leverage and controlled sliding that got the sofa to the bottom without destroying either the sofa or herself. At the landing, she had to rotate it 45 degrees to clear the quarter wall, which required another 20 minutes of problem solving that left her hands sore and her patience tested. When she finally had it positioned on the platform against the south wall, under the section of tile she had cleaned first, she sat on it and looked at the room around her. The lanterns were arranged along the walls. The books she had collected from a closing bookshop 6 blocks east were stacked in rows against the north wall on shelving she had built from reclaimed lumber. The rug she had found outside a building on East 72nd, slightly faded but structurally intact, was centered on the platform floor. Luna was asleep on the far end of the sofa with the boneless ease of an animal that has decided a place is safe. Eleanor had designed dozens of interiors in her professional life. She had managed every detail of the Hayes Development Group offices, the Connecticut property, the apartment they had kept in Chicago for 2 years before selling it. She had always worked within parameters someone else established: Victor's taste, their clients' expectations, the requirements of spaces that were ultimately for other people. This was the first time she had built something purely for herself, choosing every element for the single reason that she wanted it there, and the feeling it produced was so distinct from anything she associated with the word work that it took her a moment to identify it. She was enjoying herself, not the way you enjoy something that is easy, the way you enjoy something that is difficult and entirely yours. She lit all the lanterns at once for the first time on a Friday evening in her 6th week underground. She had been adding to the system, gradually placing each new lantern as she acquired it, never running them all simultaneously because she was rationing the charged power banks carefully. But that Friday, she had come back from the library with all 6 banks at full charge, and she set them in their positions along the walls and turned them on one by one, and then stepped back to the entrance of the platform and looked. 200 feet of Art Deco tile lit from within the emerald and gold pattern, running the length of both walls and across the vaulted ceiling, the brass fixtures catching the light and returning it warm, and doubled the books along the north wall, the rug, the sofa, Luna, a dark shape against the pale leather. Eleanor stood there for a long time without moving. She had been told explicitly and in front of witnesses that she had no skills of value, that she was unemployable, that she had nothing to offer. She looked at what she had built in 6 weeks with $60 worth of cleaning supplies, a piece of plywood, and the furniture other people had discarded. She thought about what Victor did not know and how long the list was getting. It was the 3rd Thursday of her 2nd month when she heard the tunnel door. She had been reading the lanterns down to half intensity for the evening, Luna asleep against her side on the sofa. The sound came from the north tunnel, a door she had located but never opened, a maintenance access point that connected to the active MTA infrastructure. She killed the lights in 2 seconds, darkness complete and immediate. Luna went rigid beside Hero. A flashlight beam entered the platform from the tunnel end, swinging in the methodical arc of someone who was working, not searching. The beam caught the sofa, stopped, moved to the bookshelves, stopped again. Then it found Eleanor standing beside the wall, and it stayed on her. She raised both hands slowly. "I can explain." The figure in the tunnel entrance was young, early 30s, wearing an MTA maintenance uniform with a badge clipped to the breast pocket. He stood completely still, the flashlight steady on her face, and said nothing for what felt like a long time. Then he moved the beam off her and let it drop to the floor, and he walked onto the platform. Daniel Marsh was 31 years old and had been maintaining the MTA's underground infrastructure for 8 years. He had been in every abandoned station in the New York system. He knew what they looked like: flooded or dry, structurally sound, or compromised, empty, or colonized by whatever the city discards. He had never seen anything like this. He looked at the sofa, the shelves, the clean tile gleaming in the residual light from his torch. He looked at Luna, who had decided he was not an immediate threat and gone back to sleep. He looked at Eleanor, who was still standing with her hands at her sides, watching him with the composure of someone who has already decided what she will do if this goes badly. "How long?" he said. 2 months. He walked the length of the platform, slowly examining the tile work, running 2 fingers along the brass trim. He stopped at the bookshelves and read a few spines. He came back to where she was standing. "I have to report this," he said. "If something happens to you down here, and I knew and didn't report it, I lose my certification, possibly my job." "I understand," Eleanor said. "I'll be gone by morning." He looked at her for a moment, then he looked at the sofa again, then at the clean tile running the length of both walls. "My mother slept in her car for 3 months," he said, "when I was 16. My father left, and she had 2 weeks' notice on the apartment and nowhere to go." He said it the way you state a fact that has been a fact for so long it no longer carries an active wound. She got through it. It took her 2 years after that to get stable, but she got there. Luna lifted her head, decided Daniel was settled enough to acknowledge, and went back to sleep. "Her name," he said. "Luna." He was quiet for a moment, then, "The structure down here is solid. No water intrusion on the load-bearing walls. No movement in the foundation columns. I did a full check 18 months ago and nothing has changed. He reached into his chest pocket and produced a card. That number works around the clock. Unusual sounds, vibration patterns that aren't the regular train schedule or anyone else coming through that tunnel. You call me first. He started back toward the tunnel entrance and stopped. He had his flashlight on the wall at the far end of the utility corridor on the metal panel Eleanor had marked with an X in her second week. He moved closer. He tilted the light at an angle and examined the screws, the seam, the way the panel met the surrounding concrete. You open this yet? I don't have the right tools. He looked at it for another few seconds. That's not MTA installation. Wrong gauge fasteners, wrong alloy for this period. Someone put that in after the station was decommissioned. He paused. Probably mid-40s, early 50s based on the oxidation pattern. He left. Eleanor heard his footsteps recede down the tunnel until they were gone. She stood in the dark for a long time after. She was not thinking about the fact that she had just avoided discovery. She was thinking about what he had said someone put that in after the station closed. In the years between 1952 and the bank's collapse in 1974, someone had come down here into a sealed and forgotten station and installed something in the wall, and then the bank had failed, and the people who knew had died or dispersed, and the station had sat here untouched for half a century. She went to the panel. She put her palm flat against the metal. It was cold and slightly rough with age. She needed the right tools. She would have them by the weekend. She bought the tools on a Saturday morning. A heavy screwdriver in the right gauge, a small pry bar, and a short-handled hammer from the hardware store on Fulton Street. She paid cash. That evening, she worked at the panel for 2 hours. The screws had been in the wall for 70 years. The first one took 40 minutes. The second and third came out faster once she understood the angle. The fourth was stripped and required the pry bar applied carefully to avoid damaging the surrounding tile. The panel came away from the wall in one piece. Behind it was a cavity in the concrete roughly 18 inches deep. And set into the back of that cavity, embedded in the wall so that it sat flush with the surrounding concrete, was a vault door. It was approximately 3 feet square, solid steel with a combination dial at the center and a handle to the right. The dial was mechanical analog, the kind manufactured in the 1930s and 40s, when combination locks were precision instruments built to last for generations. The handle showed no rust on the contact surfaces. The seal around the door was intact. Eleanor sat back on her heels and looked at it. She was sitting in an abandoned transit station beneath a bank building that had failed 50 years ago, looking at a vault that no one had opened in at least that long, possibly longer, a vault that did not appear in any documented inventory of the property, that no official record acknowledged as existing. She reached out and tried the handle. It did not move. She sat on the utility room floor for a long time thinking. The library's archive of financial regulatory documents extended to digitized microfilm records from the 1970s. Eleanor spent 4 full days in the periodical section reading. What she found built slowly, the way a complicated picture builds when you are assembling it from fragments spread across multiple sources. Hartwell and Crane had operated in the final decade of its existence a service for a select group of clients that did not appear in any of its public documentation. The service involved the creation of offshore accounts, the routing of funds through correspondent banks in the Caribbean and Western Europe, and the maintenance of records kept separate from the bank's official ledgers. It was tax evasion structured with enough layers of complexity that the participants could tell themselves it was simply aggressive financial planning. The records of this service had not been transferred to First National Group in 1974. They were not part of the official acquisition. They had been according to the internal memo Eleanor found in a digitized archive of a regulatory investigation from 1976, unaccounted for at the time of the acquisition. The investigation had noted the discrepancy and classified it as a documentation failure. The case had been closed without resolution. The records had not been lost. They had been in the wall. Eleanor photographed every page of every document she had found in the library, stored them in a secure cloud account under an email address she had created for the purpose, and spent the following 2 evenings making a list of what she still needed. She needed to know what was in the vault. She needed to open it. She found a digitized catalog of common factory default combinations used by the Diebold Vault Company in the 1930s and 1940s. 87 combinations organized by model year and production run. She printed the list at the library, folded it into her notebook, and went back underground. Every evening for this next 10 days, she worked through the list. She sat cross-legged on the utility room floor with the lantern positioned to illuminate the dial, the printed list on her knee, and tried each combination in sequence. She noted each attempt in her notebook with a check mark. The dial was stiff but functional, the mechanism intact. The vault had been built well, it was simply locked. On the 71st attempt on a Tuesday evening, in her third month underground, she felt the resistance change. The final number aligned. The dial stopped with a solidity that was different from every other stop on every other attempt, a definitiveness that was physical rather than mechanical. She put her hand on the handle. It turned. The door was heavy, 40 pounds at least, and it moved on hinges that had not been exercised in decades. It came open slowly, the steel edge scraping against the concrete floor, with a sound that had not existed in this room since sometime before 1974. Inside, 9 metal file boxes stacked in 2 columns covered in a uniform layer of fine gray dust. Arranged with the precision of someone who expected to come back for them, Eleanor lifted the first box and set it on the floor beside the lantern. She opened the lid. Ledger sheets, transaction records, correspondence on Hartwell and Crane, letterhead, dated 1968 through 1974. She opened the second box. More of the same earlier years. The third box was organized differently, the documents separated by client name rather than by date. She read for an hour before she found it. It was on a single page near the back of the third box, a summary document with a header that read, "Client continuation referred by legacy account holder," and a date of 2001, decades after the bank itself had ceased to exist. The name at the top of the summary was typed in the clean serif font of a document that had been produced long after the typewriter era, printed and filed among papers that predated it by 30 years. Victor J. Hayes. Eleanor did not move for a long time. She sat on the floor of a utility room in an abandoned station beneath a bank that had been dead for half a century, and she looked at her former husband's name on a piece of paper that should not exist in a vault that no one knew was there, and she understood several things simultaneously. She understood that Victor had been hiding money since the year they were married. She understood that he had done it through a system that had survived the collapse of the institution that created it, maintained by someone who kept the old network functioning underground after the bank itself was gone. She understood that during their divorce proceedings, while Carolyn Whitfield was demonstrating to a court that Eleanor had no assets and no leverage, and no future worth protecting, Victor had been sitting on a separate financial reality that he had been building for 20 years. She placed the document carefully on the clean surface of the adjacent file box. She took out her phone. She photographed it, and then she photographed every other page in the third box, and then she started on the second box, and then the first. She worked until the power banks were low and the lantern had dimmed to its minimum setting. She sat in the near dark, with the vault standing open beside her, 9 boxes of documents arrayed on the floor, and she thought about the sequence of what needed to happen next. She thought about it carefully. Order mattered. Timing mattered. She had one opportunity to do this correctly, and correctly meant that when it was done, it could not be undone. She closed the vault. She did not lock it again. She went to her room and lay down. In the morning, she would go back to the library, but not for financial records this time. She needed to find James Holt. The search for James Holt took 4 days. He was 62 years old, retired, living in a rented apartment in Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn. He had worked for Hartwell and Crane from 1969 until the bank's closure in 1974, serving in his final year as assistant branch manager. After the acquisition, he had worked for 3 subsequent institutions before retiring quietly in 2018. He had not given interviews about Hartwell and Crane. He had not appeared in any of the journalism or regulatory documentation about the 1974 collapse. He had, to all appearances, spent 50 years being very careful to remain unnoticed. Eleanor sent a letter to his address through the Postal Service. No return address, no name. Inside, a photocopy of a single page from the ledgers, a page that bore a column of figures and a reference code she had cross-checked against the offshore account structure she had spent 2 weeks documenting. Below the photocopy, she had written in her own handwriting, "If you recognize these numbers, I would like to talk. No police. No recordings, just a conversation." And a phone number she had registered to the prepaid phone she had bought 6 weeks earlier. He called on the 5th day. They met in Prospect Park on a Wednesday morning at a bench near the boathouse, in the kind of mild October weather that makes New York feel briefly forgiving. James Holt arrived on time, which told Eleanor something. He was a compact man, gray-haired, with the slightly compressed quality of someone who has been carrying a specific weight for a long time and has adjusted his posture around it. He sat down without greeting her and looked at the copy of the ledger page she placed on the bench between them. "Where did you get this?" he said. Not a question, a statement with an implied demand behind it. "From the place Hartwell and Crane left it." He looked at her. "That's not possible. I know what the acquisition documents say. I also know what they don't say." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up. Eleanor did not move. She said, "You've been carrying this for 50 years, Mr. Holt. I'm not asking you to carry it alone anymore. I'm asking you to help me put it somewhere it can do some good." He did not sit back down immediately. He stood with his back to her for long enough that she thought he would simply walk away, and she had already decided that if he did, she had enough without him. Then he sat. "Victor Hayes came to me in 2001, he said, through a former client of the bank who was still using the system we'd built. The bank was gone, but the accounts weren't. They'd been maintained through a correspondent network in the Caribbean running on their own momentum because no one had ever officially closed them." He looked at the boathouse. Hayes was young. He knew exactly what he wanted. "I set up his access. I knew it was wrong. I did it anyway because the people involved had resources, and I was being careful about my own situation." "Kestrel Holdings," Eleanor said. He turned to look at her directly for the first time. "You know about Kestrel. I know it exists. I don't know the full structure." He was quiet again. "Then Kestrel Holdings LLC incorporated in Delaware in 2010. A shell company used to consolidate and redirect funds from the offshore accounts into a separate structure. Your husband used it to move money that wasn't showing up in any of his domestic financial disclosures. The total held through that vehicle when I last had visibility was somewhere above $7 million. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded envelope. "I kept this as insurance. I want you to understand that I am not a good person for having kept it rather than done something with it sooner. I know that." He placed the envelope on the bench. "It's the email chain between Hayes and the attorney who helped him structure Kestrel. Her name is on it." Eleanor did not need to open it to know whose name was on it. She picked up the envelope and placed it in her bag. She looked at the park around them, the trees at the edge of their fall color, a pair of joggers moving along the far path. "One condition," James said. "Don't use my name until there's no other choice." "I'll respect that as long as I can." He nodded. He stood up from the bench and buttoned his coat. He looked at her one last time with an expression she could not fully read, something between relief and the specific exhaustion of a man who has finally put something heavy down. He walked away through the park. Eleanor sat for a moment longer. She had come into that conversation knowing about $15 million in hidden assets. She was leaving it with documentation of nearly $22 million of paper trail connecting Victor not just to offshore accounts, but to a deliberately constructed financial vehicle built with the help of the attorney who had represented him against her in court. She had 4 envelopes to prepare. She had already decided who they would go to and in what order. She stood up and walked toward the subway entrance at the park's edge, and it occurred to her not for the first time that the thing Victor had been most confident about when he stood on the sidewalk and told her she had no skills and no future was the very thing that had turned out to be most wrong. He had assumed she would try to fight the way he would fight. Loudly, expensively, immediately, with lawyers and motions and countersuits that burned through money and left visible tracks. He did not know that she was patient. He had never in 23 years needed to find out. That evening back in the station, Eleanor opened her notebook to a clean page. She wrote 4 addresses. Below them, she wrote, "Timing is the only variable I still control." Below that, she wrote a single sentence and underlined it twice. "Not today, but soon." She closed the notebook. Luna jumped onto her lap. Somewhere above them, the city moved through its evening without knowing what was waiting below it in a room that no map acknowledged and no record described, in the hands of a woman that everyone above ground had already decided was finished. She prepared the envelopes on a Monday, not because Monday held any particular significance, but because by Sunday night she had finished everything that needed to be finished before she could act. The cloud accounts held complete copies of every document. The chronology she had built over 3 months of library research was annotated and organized. The email chain James Holt had given her was authenticated against the dates and account numbers in the vault records. Everything was cross-referenced, everything held together. She worked at the small desk she had placed in the station manager's office, The room she had furnished with a chair and a lamp and nothing unnecessary. She had bought 5 large envelopes and 5 sets of certified mail receipts. She addressed them in her own handwriting because her handwriting could not be traced to a printer or a device, and because there was something appropriate about doing it by hand. These documents had been written by hand in an era before everything was automated, and they deserved the same deliberateness now. The first envelope went to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, addressed to the unit that handled offshore tax evasion. Inside a complete copy of the Hartwell and Crane offshore records pertaining to Victor Hayes, the transaction timeline she had constructed showing movement of funds between 2001 and the present, and a one-page summary she had written herself estimating the federal tax liability at a minimum of $4.7 million. At the bottom of the summary in the line for the sender's name, she wrote, "A concerned citizen." The second envelope went to the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance. Similar documentation focused on the state-level obligations. The third was the one that mattered most. It went to the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, the office that prosecuted financial crimes in Manhattan. This envelope contained everything: the full Hartwell and Crane records, the Kestrel Holdings documentation, and the email chain from James Holt, showing the correspondence between Victor and Carolyn Whitfield in 2010 as they constructed the shell company together. The cover letter was 3 paragraphs and cited 4 specific federal statutes. She had drafted it in the library over 2 days reading case law until she understood exactly what language would be taken seriously and what would be dismissed. The fourth envelope went to her divorce attorney. She had been paying him a small monthly retainer to maintain the relationship, drawing from her settlement funds against the possibility that this moment would come. Inside, she placed the full evidentiary package in a handwritten note: "Reopen Hayes. Full fraudulent disclosure during marriage and proceedings. Evidence enclosed. I want everything I am owed." She held the fifth envelope for a moment before sealing it. She had bought Amber Stokes's address from a public records service for $14. She had thought about this fifth envelope longer than any of the others because it was the only one that was not about justice in any legal sense. It was about something smaller and more personal. It was about a young woman who had asked a quiet question outside a house on East 74th Street and who had not yet understood what kind of man she had asked it of. Inside the fifth envelope was a single sheet of paper. On it, Eleanor had written, "If he tries to make you responsible for what he did, you are not without options." Below that, a name and phone number of a criminal defense attorney she had researched and considered reliable. Nothing else. No explanation, no return address. She sealed all 5 envelopes and stacked them on the desk. Then she put on her coat, picked up the stack, and walked to a post office 3 miles from the station, one she had never used before. She sent the first 3 envelopes certified mail. She sent the 4th to her attorney by overnight courier. She dropped the 5th into a standard mailbox on the corner outside. She walked back to the station in the November cold with her hands in her pockets and her mind deliberately empty. She had done the thing. The thing was in motion. Now she waited. Waiting turned out to be its own kind of work. She had expected the 6 weeks that followed to feel suspended, a period of anxious stillness between action and consequence. Instead, they were among the most productive weeks she had spent underground. She had been writing since her 2nd week in the station. Not the journal entries she had kept in the early days, but something more structured. An essay, or what was becoming one. Its subject was the station itself, the architecture, the history of the Crane family, and the bank, the specific visual language of New York's underground transit spaces in the 1930s. She wrote about adaptive reuse, about the relationship between abandonment and preservation, about what it meant that a city could contain within itself spaces of genuine beauty that no living person had seen in 70 years. She did not write about living there, not yet. By the 5th week, the essay was 40 pages. She had sourced photographs from the library's archived digitized images of the station at its opening in 1931, the Crane family at the ribbon cutting the first commuters moving through the platform in their winter coats. She had cross-referenced the architectural drawings Daniel had mentioned against the physical reality of the space, identifying where the original design had been modified during construction and where it had been faithfully executed. She sent the essay to 3 architecture publications under her own name. 2 did not respond. The 3rd replied within a week. They wanted to publish it. They wanted photographs of the current state of the station. They wanted to know how she had gained access. She told them she had been conducting independent research on abandoned New York transit infrastructure and had located an accessible entry point. She told them the photographs would follow. She did not tell them anything else. It was while she was reading the editor's response that the notification came through on the news app she had kept installed on her phone precisely for this purpose. She had set an alert for Victor's name 6 weeks before mailing the envelopes. The headline read, "Manhattan real estate developer Victor Hayes arrested on federal tax fraud charges." She read the article once, then a second time. The federal investigation had moved faster than she had estimated, which told her the documentation had been compelling enough to accelerate the process. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division had coordinated with the Southern District. Agents had executed search warrants at Victor's office on West 57th Street and at the house on East 74th. His domestic bank accounts had been frozen pending the investigation. He had been taken into custody Tuesday morning and released on $2 million bond by Tuesday afternoon. His attorney, a man named Garfield, who specialized in white-collar criminal defense, was quoted, "Mr. Hayes maintains his complete innocence and is confident this matter will be resolved in his favor." Eleanor put the phone face down on her desk. She sat in the office for a long time without moving. Outside the open door, the platform stretched away in the warm light of the lanterns, the clean tile and the brass fixtures and the books along the north wall, all of it exactly as she had made it. She had imagined this moment many times over the past months, had wondered what she would feel when it arrived. What she felt was not triumph. It was not satisfaction exactly. It was closer to the specific quiet that follows the resolution of a long tension, the way a room sounds after a sustained note has finally ended. She picked up the phone and called her attorney, Eleanor. His voice carried the controlled energy of a man managing several urgent things at once. "I've been trying to reach you for 3 days. I know. I've been away from my phone. The documentation you sent is extraordinary. I have to ask you directly, and I need you to be honest with me because the answer matters for how we proceed. Where did it come from?" "I found it," she said, "in a location connected to the bank that originally handled the accounts. The location was on public property. I can provide documentation establishing the circumstances of the discovery if the court requires it." A pause. "That may be exactly what we need. The defense will challenge the provenance. We need to be ready for that. I have a witness who can establish the legitimacy of the physical location and a separate witness who can authenticate the documents themselves. Both are prepared to cooperate." Another pause longer. "Eleanor, what are we talking about in total assets? I mean, everything." She told him the number. $22 million across the offshore accounts and Kestrel Holdings, plus the domestic assets from the original settlement. She heard him exhale. "We're going to file to reopen tomorrow morning. This is not a close case. What he did during the proceedings was straightforward, fraudulent financial disclosure. Combined with the criminal charges, his negotiating position is essentially non-existent." He paused. "You could walk away from this with everything that was ever actually yours, the house, half the real assets, damages for the fraud. We're talking about a number that could reach $8 million in cash and assets, possibly more." Eleanor looked at the vault door still standing open in the corner of the utility room, visible through the office doorway. Empty now, its contents distributed across secure servers and certified mail envelopes, the physical boxes stored in a rented unit in Brooklyn under a name that connected to nothing. "File it," she said. What happened to Carolyn Whitfield surprised Eleanor, though in retrospect, it should not have. Carolyn had been effective for Victor for exactly as long as it served her to be. The moment the email chain in James Holt's envelope placed her name inside the Kestrel Holdings structure, her calculus changed. She was not a criminal by vocation. She was a tactician. And tacticians understand that the first person to cooperate gets the best terms. Eleanor learned this from her attorney, who heard it from a contact at the Southern District who was not supposed to say anything, but said it anyway because that is how information moves in a city like New York. Carolyn had called the prosecutors within 2 weeks of Victor's arrest and offered full cooperation in exchange for immunity from prosecution. She had provided the complete documentation trail for Kestrel Holdings, including $7.1 million in assets that had not appeared in Eleanor's original package because she had not known to look for them. The woman who had told Eleanor in a courthouse hallway that she was paid to win had done exactly that. She had simply changed sides when winning required it. Eleanor did not feel anger about this. She felt something closer to a tired recognition. Carolyn had always been consistent. She had just finally become consistent in a direction that was useful. The thing that was harder to process was Amber. 3 weeks after Victor's arrest, Eleanor's attorney received a call from a woman identifying herself as Amber Stokes. She had received Eleanor's envelope. She had also received something else, a statement Victor's defense team had filed with investigators that identified her by name and job title as the individual responsible for managing the offshore accounts at his direction. Victor had been cornered and had done what cornered people do when they have spent their lives treating other people as expendable. He had pointed at the nearest available person and said her name. Amber was 29 years old and had believed until approximately 3 weeks ago that she was in a relationship with a man who valued her. She was now staring at a potential federal investigation into her own conduct with no legal representation and no resources. Eleanor's attorney relayed the situation and asked for instructions. Eleanor thought about a woman standing on a sidewalk in front of a house that had never belonged to either of them, asking a quiet question in a low voice. Did you have to do it in front of everyone? She gave her instructions. She told her attorney to communicate to Amber's newly retained lawyer that Eleanor would make no statement implicating Amber in any financial conduct, would not name her in any civil proceedings, and would provide a character reference if one became useful. In return, Amber was to tell the truth. All of it. Everything Victor had instructed her to do when and why. Amber told the truth. Her testimony, delivered to federal investigators over 2 days in December, removed the last structural support from Victor's defense. She had not been managing the accounts. She had been asked on 3 occasions to route certain wire transfers through specific intermediary accounts and had done so without being told what the transfers were for. She had kept the emails. She had kept the instructions. She had kept everything the way young people keep things when they sense, without fully understanding why, that the situation they are in might one day require evidence. Victor's attorney filed a request for a plea negotiation the following week. The reopened divorce proceedings lasted 4 months and produced a result that Eleanor's attorney described with the careful understatement of someone who has practiced law for 30 years as comprehensive. The original settlement was voided entirely. Victor's fraudulent financial disclosure during the proceedings was entered into the record without meaningful challenge. The court appointed a financial examiner who spent 6 weeks working through the offshore accounts, the Kestrel structure, and the domestic assets, producing a report that quantified the total estate at just over $29 million. Eleanor was entitled to half. She negotiated instead for a specific allocation, $8.4 million in cash and liquid assets, the house on East 74th Street, at its current appraised value of $3.1 million, and a payment of $600,000 in damages for the fraud perpetrated against her during the original proceedings. $12.1 million total. Victor retained what remained after the IRS settlement. The federal fines, his legal fees, and Eleanor's allocation. The number was not large. He would not be homeless, but he would not be building anything new for a very long time. He accepted a plea agreement in February. 7 years with the possibility of parole after 5. He reported to a federal correctional facility in upstate New York on a Tuesday morning in March, which was, Eleanor noted, when she read the news item almost exactly 2 years after the day she had stood on the sidewalk with her suitcase and her cat and watched a locksmith change the locks. Her attorney called with a question she had not expected. Eleanor, before we close everything out, I need to ask. The vault, the station, the physical location where you found the documents. What are your intentions with respect to that property? She had been thinking about this for longer than he knew. There was also a practical matter she had not mentioned to her attorney yet, one that she had spent 2 weeks resolving through Daniel before the plea agreement was even finalized. When Victor's defense team had challenged the provenance of the documents during the divorce proceedings, arguing they had been obtained through unauthorized access to private property, Eleanor had been prepared. Daniel had filed a formal report with the MTA's Infrastructure Division 6 weeks before the challenge was raised. The report documented his discovery during a routine safety inspection of a previously unrecorded vault structure within the Hartwell and Crane station. The report noted that the vault was not listed in any MTA inventory, had not been included in the original property transfer documentation from 1974, and had been found in an open and accessible state. The report was stamped, dated, and entered into the official MTA record. Eleanor had asked Daniel directly before he filed it whether he understood what he was doing. I'm filing an accurate report, he had said. Everything in it is true. It's also going to protect me in a legal proceeding. If your employer connects those two things, your position becomes difficult. He had looked at her with the even patience of someone who has considered a thing carefully and arrived at a decision he intends to keep. My mother worked 2 jobs for 6 years to get us out of the situation we were in. She never complained. She never asked anyone to fix it for her. She just kept going. He picked up his pen. Filing an accurate report is what I'm paid to do. What happens after that isn't my department. He filed it the next morning. The defense challenge collapsed within 2 weeks. The documents had been found on public property in an unregistered vault by a party with documented legitimate access to the location. There was no legal theory under which they could be excluded. Eleanor had never told him what his report was worth to her case. She did not need to. He already knew. The city owned the station. It had owned it since the MTA absorbed the remnants of the old transit authority in the 1960s, and it had done nothing with it for 70 years except seal it and occasionally note its existence on infrastructure maps as a decommissioned facility. The building above it, the former Hartwell and Crane Bank building, had been converted to luxury condominiums in 2008. The station itself had never been part of that development because no one involved in the conversion had known it was directly below. Eleanor had spent 3 months researching what it would take to acquire it legally. She had spoken to a real estate attorney who specialized in municipal property transactions. She had spoken to a historic preservation architect who had, upon hearing the description of the station's condition and design, become audibly excited in a way that professionals rarely allow themselves to be. She called the city's Office of Property Management and asked for a meeting. The meeting was conducted over 2 sessions with a deputy commissioner named Edward Simmons, a careful man in his late 50s who had spent his career managing transactions involving properties that did not fit neatly into any standard category. He had seen abandoned firehouses, decommissioned water tunnels, and a 19th century ferry terminal that had been used as a storage facility for 20 years. He had not seen anything quite like what Eleanor described. She brought the 40-page essay. She brought the architectural drawings Daniel had sourced from the MTA archive. She brought the photographs she had taken over the months of restoration before and after the tile revealed the brass, cleaned the space as it looked now. She brought a detailed proposal for the station's future use as a cultural center, the platform as a performance space, the utility rooms as artist studios, the tunnel as gallery. Simmons studied the photographs for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up. "How did you get access to this site?" "I found an entry point that had not been secured," Eleanor said. "I documented my access and the condition of the property at the time of first entry. I can provide that documentation." He looked at the photographs again. "And you did this restoration work yourself?" "Most of it?" He was quiet for another moment. "Our asking price for a property of this classification would typically be in the range of $2 million. He paused. "Given the restoration work that has already been completed at no cost to the city, and given the proposed public use, I believe I could recommend a figure of $2.1 million to the relevant committee." "I'll have my attorney prepare the paperwork," Eleanor said. She paid $2.1 million for the station 3 weeks later. It was the best investment she had ever made, and she had known it would be before she wrote the check. The renovation took 9 months and consumed another $3 million from her settlement, which left her with a financial position that was comfortable rather than extravagant, which was exactly what she wanted. Daniel Marsh was hired as technical director for the project. He knew the infrastructure below better than any engineer the renovation firm brought in, and he knew how the station connected to the living system of tunnels around it, which mattered for ventilation and drainage, and a dozen practical problems that the architects would not have anticipated on their own. He took the job without lengthy negotiation, named his salary requirement once, and showed up on the first day with a set of hand-drawn notes about the structural characteristics of each section of the station that he had been assembling quietly for years. The architects were a firm that specialized in historic preservation. On their first site visit, the lead architect, a woman named Clara Reed, stood at the entrance of the platform and did not speak for nearly a full minute. Then she turned to Eleanor and said, "You cleaned this yourself." Over about 3 weeks, Clara Reed looked at the tile, the brass, the full length of the platform. "With what?" "Cleaning solution and brushes, and time." Clara Reed made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I've been doing this for 20 years. I've never seen a private individual do what you've done here. This should have taken a professional team 6 months." "I had a great deal to think about," Eleanor said. It helped to have something to do with my hands. The renovation restored what was original and added what was necessary. The tile was professionally treated and sealed. The brass was repolished and protected. The original advertising boards were preserved behind glass panels that allowed them to be seen without being touched. Proper electrical plumbing and ventilation were installed along routes that minimized impact on the historic fabric of the space. A discreet entrance was constructed connecting to the lobby of the building above which the condominium association agreed to after 3 months of negotiation and a payment Eleanor made without complaint because she understood that getting what you need sometimes means paying what someone else requires to give it to you. The platform became the performance space, 1,200 square feet of restored Art Deco architecture that seated 200 people in chairs arranged facing the tunnel end, where a stage had been built into the space that the trains had once entered. The utility rooms became 4 artist studios, each with its own entrance, each rented below market rate to working artists selected by a committee Eleanor established and chaired. The tunnel extending northward from the platform became the gallery lit with the careful restraint of a space that understood its own character. She named it the Hartwell Arts Center. The small room at the far end of the station, the 12 by 12 room where she had slept on folded sweaters in her first week underground, she did not renovate. She kept it exactly as it was. Clean tile, a single brass fixture on the ceiling, the door that latched from inside. She put nothing in it except a small chair and a lamp. It was the only space in the building not open to the public, not listed in any program or brochure. It was hers. The opening was on a Thursday evening in October, 3 years to the month after Eleanor had first descended the steps with a dying flashlight and a cat in a carrier. James Holt arrived 20 minutes before the program began, ticket in hand, paid for, at the box office like any other attendee. He was wearing a suit that looked like it had been recently pressed for an occasion he had been anticipating for some time. He found Eleanor near the stage entrance and shook her hand with both of his, which was not something she had expected from him. "I want to say something," he said. "You don't have to. I want to." He looked at the platform, the audience filling the seats, the tile glowing under the stage lights. "I worked in this building for 5 years. I walked past that grate on the sidewalk every day for 5 years and never once thought about what was below it. The people who built this place put real care into it, and then it sat in the dark for 70 years because no one thought it was worth the trouble to look." He paused. "You looked." Eleanor looked at him. "You helped me understand what I was looking at. That mattered." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding whether to say the rest of what he had come to say. He had the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is now uncertain whether the rehearsed version is the honest one. "I spent 50 years not saying anything," he said finally. "I told myself it was because there was nothing to say anymore, that the bank was gone and the people were gone and the whole thing had been resolved by time. But that wasn't the reason." He looked at the audience settling into their seats, at the young musicians arranging themselves on the stage. "The reason was that I was afraid that saying something would cost me more than staying quiet. And that calculus never really changed until you gave me a reason to change it." "You changed it yourself," Eleanor said. "I just asked the question." He shook his head slowly. "You did more than that. You showed me that the right thing to do was still possible. At 62, I had stopped believing that." He straightened his jacket. "I wanted you to know that this place, what you've built here, it means something different to me than it probably means to anyone else in that room tonight. And I'm grateful you let me be part of it." He found his seat in the front row and sat down and did not look at her again, which she understood was his way of saying that the conversation was complete. Daniel was at the technical board at the back of the hall, monitoring the sound system, occasionally making small adjustments with the focused attention of someone who takes satisfaction in doing a specific job well. He caught Eleanor's eye once and gave her a brief nod, the nod of a person who sees that the thing they helped build is working as it was supposed to work. The quartet took the stage at 7:30. 4 musicians young from a conservatory in Brooklyn that Eleanor had partnered with to provide the opening night program. They played Beethoven the String Quartet No. 14, a piece written when Beethoven was completely deaf and had been for years, a piece he composed by a process that was purely internal, working from a musical architecture that existed only in his imagination. Eleanor stood in the wings and listened. Luna was on the chair in the small back room, sleeping as she had been sleeping in various corners of this station for 3 years. She was older now, slower, more selective about which position she held for extended periods. But she was there. The music filled the platform, and the tile and the brass and the vaulted ceiling held it and returned. It changed warmer and more resonant than it would have been in a concert hall designed from scratch. The space contributed something. That was the thing about old places that had been used and then abandoned and then recovered. They had a quality that could not be engineered in from the beginning. It came from everything that had happened in them, including the long silence. Eleanor had been asked by 3 different journalists in the weeks before the opening the same question in slightly different forms. The question was always about the turning point. When did you know? When did you believe it would work out? When did the plan become a plan rather than a desperate attempt to survive? She had given each of them a version of the truth that was true but not complete. She had said, when I found what I found in the station, I understood that patience was the only advantage I had, and I used it. The fuller truth, the one she had not said aloud to anyone, was something she had understood on a Tuesday night in a diner near Grand Central, sitting in a booth with a cup of cold coffee and a phone screen showing Victor's email and her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The turning point was not when she found the vault. It was not when she read Victor's name in the documents. It was not when the envelopes were mailed or the headline appeared or the settlement was finalized. The turning point was that Tuesday night when she had sat with everything stripped away and said to herself out loud and quietly in a booth no one was paying attention to, I am not done. That was the decision. Everything else was the execution. Earlier that same week, before the envelopes and before the arrest and before the trial and before any of it, Victor had sent one final message through his attorney after the plea agreement was signed. It was not an apology. It was a single question: how? Eleanor had written back through her attorney in her own words. She had taken her time with it. She had said, you built your empire on things you believed you had buried deep enough that no one would find them. You did not consider that you might bury them next to someone patient enough to wait for the right moment and precise enough to use what she found. You called me unemployable. You were describing the wrong skills. The skills I was developing were the ones you taught me to keep invisible. For 23 years, I organized, planned, solved problems, and built things with no credit and no record. I was doing exactly that when I found what you had hidden. I was just doing it for myself this time. She had not heard from him again. The quartet reached the final movement, the piece building toward its resolution, with the particular quality of arriving somewhere that felt both inevitable and hard-won. Eleanor listened and thought about the man who had written it in total silence, who had felt the music as vibration through the floor and through the bones of the people who played it, who had refused to stop making things simply because the primary channel through which he received the world had closed. Some losses become their own kind of resource. That was what she had learned in the station. That was what she knew now that she had not known before. Victor was in his second year of a 7-year sentence. He had sent the how message and received her answer and gone quiet, and Eleanor took his silence as confirmation that she had said exactly the right thing, and he had understood exactly what he needed to understand. The quartet finished. The platform filled with applause, 200 people in a room that had held nothing but silence and dust for 3/4 of a century. Eleanor stepped out of the wings and stood at the edge of the stage, not to be seen but to see. The audience, the towel, the brass, the light, James in the front row, his hands still after the applause subsided, looking at the tunnel where the stage met the darkness beyond. Daniel at the board, already checking the next item on his list. The 4 musicians standing together on the stage that had once been a place where trains arrived and departed. On the wall of the small back room beside the lamp and the chair, Eleanor had placed a single object the week before the opening. It was a small brass plate mounted at eye level, the kind of plate you see on the walls of historic buildings marking dates and names. She had designed it herself and had it made by a metalworker in Red Hook. It read, Vault Discovered Here 2024. Some things buried long enough become foundations. E.H. The lights in the platform slowly dimmed as the audience began to move toward the exit, talking quietly among themselves, carrying the music with them up the stairs and back into the city. Eleanor stayed until the last of them had gone. Then she walked to the small room at the end of the station and sat in the chair and turned off the lamp and sat in the dark for a while the way she used to in the early months. It felt different now. It had always been quiet down here. But now the quiet was chosen rather than circumstantial, and that distinction she had come to understand was the difference between hiding and resting. Luna found her in the dark the way she always did, by sound and warmth, and settled into her lap. Eleanor sat in the station that was hers in the city that had forgotten this place for 70 years and then watched it come back, and she thought about what it meant to have been thrown away and to have landed somewhere that turned out to be exactly the right place. She had not planned for any of it. Not the grate, not the vault, not the documents, not the name on the page. She had planned only to survive long enough to think clearly, and in the space that survival created, she had found everything else. The trains ran somewhere nearby in the dark, the current system passing close without touching this place, the city continuing above her as it always had. She could feel the faint vibration through the floor, steady and rhythmic, the pulse of a thing that had been running for longer than anyone alive could remember. She stayed until she was ready to go up. Then she picked up Luna, turned on the small lamp one last time, looked at the brass plate on the wall, and climbed the stairs back into the light.